Basically, narcissism is a little like a car or automobile, as your listeners may be more familiar with. It's made up of many different parts. So if I came to you with a tyre, for example, or a wheel hub with a tyre on it, and said that was a car, you would say, no, it's not. It's part of a car. And I think where a lot of the confusion arises is that narcissism is actually made up of, there are 9 different qualities or traits or behaviours that are recognised that actually make up a formal diagnosis of narcissism. And in order for someone to have a clinical diagnosis, which does exist, it's called narcissistic personality disorder, they have to demonstrate on a consistent basis. So this isn't a one-off, I'm having a bad day. This is something that they do over a long period of time, and they do it consistently with everyone. It's not just although it will be seen, I guess, more acutely by one person because they get the unfiltered approach. But basically, for someone to be diagnosed with this narcissistic personality disorder, they have to demonstrate at least 5 traits in a way that causes significant interference with love or work over an extended period of time.
Welcome to Minutes with Mango, Life in Motion. I'm your host, Johnny Mango. This is the place where we inquire about lifestyle, culture, and careers. Weekly, we meet with new guests that make a contribution of their insightful stories about their careers and how those careers impact their lifestyle and culture. Hello, everybody. This is Johnny Mango, and today we have a guest from the UK, actually, and his name is Dr. Stuart Wood. He has a PhD in neuroscience, and I thought it would be interesting to hear from Stuart because of his background and his experience, his personal experience dealing with abusive relationships. Dr. Wood, welcome.
Thank you very much.
To tell you what, the thing what we like to start with here at Minutes with Mango is tell us about your background. Share with us your story.
Well, I grew up as the youngest of 4 children. My brother was born just before the end of World War II. So growing up in the family, it was very much, I was born in the late 50s, but it was still that era when people were recovering from, the hardships of conflict, etc. And so I think there was a kind of grit your teeth and do it sort of attitude, which overflowed into family dynamics. So it was quite easy to feel an expectation of having to achieve in order to be acceptable or to be good enough. And that sort of carried through my life. There were times when I really didn't want to do the work, when I just had no confidence in my own ability, etc. So it was a bit of a battle within me as I grew up, to the point that by the time I got to 17, 18 years old, which was when we in the UK take our exams for university entry, I'd kind of lost my way a bit. And so I went to university for what ended up as being 10 weeks. And the only thing I came home with was a drum kit, which didn't really make mum and dad that happy. But really, after a couple of years out and a couple of years working, I really rekindled an interest and a love of learning. And so I then went back to university, spent 8 years there, which ended with me getting my PhD in neuroscience. I then worked in the pharmaceutical industry for just under 20 years, and I was involved in designing and running and reporting clinical trials on new and established medications. In 2007, the company that I worked for decided that they didn't want to stay in pharmaceuticals, so they sold off the medical division. I went with it, and so did my job. So really, since 2007, I've been finding my way, but continuing that sort of neuroscience thread, and also a love of people which I always enjoyed. Even working in the clinical trials, sure, there was lots of science involved, but it was that people-to-people interaction that really kept me stimulated, motivated, and going. I continued to basically move in a sort of more people-orientated direction. So I took a year or two to sort out exactly what I wanted to do, but it ended up with me working with people of all ages to help them overcome their fears. A fairly novel method. It's called exposure therapy. I happen to use snakes and spiders and scorpions and various animals, but other people do it in different ways. But the essence is you encourage people to face their fears, to actually overcome their fears and help them realize that they can do a lot more than they believe possible. And it was whilst I was doing this work, I had the misfortune to have a heart attack and ended up in hospital, and then had heart surgery, which had one or two complications. I was in hospital for quite a long time, and a little bit like being a barber or a hairdresser, people come to hospital, I think, not only to see the patient, but to offload and to chat. And I started speaking to a friend who was clearly struggling with their marriage. And after some time, really just talking, it became apparent that they were in an abusive marriage, that they wanted to leave. And so I opted to support them through that, not realizing that it was going to take probably 3.5 to 5 years for them to actually properly leave and start to rebuild their life. So that's my story. It's hardly a brief introduction, but it gives you a feel for where I've come from, and I guess how I've ended up in the work, dealing with narcissistic stroke abusive relationships.
Regarding community relationships and this general narcissistic behaviors that you've identified, can you tell us a little bit more about that, just in general, about narcissistic behavior and define that for us?
Yeah, it's as you can imagine, it's quite a big subject, and there's a lot being said on it. Basically, narcissism is a little like a car or automobile, as your listeners may be more familiar with. It's made up of many different parts. So if I came to you with a tyre, for example, or a wheel hub with a tyre on it, and said that was a car, you would say, no, it's not. It's part of a car. And I think where a lot of the confusion arises is that narcissism is actually made up of, there are 9 different qualities or traits or behaviors that are recognized that actually make up a formal diagnosis of narcissism. And in order for someone to have a clinical diagnosis, which does exist, it's called narcissistic personality disorder, they have to demonstrate on a consistent basis. So this isn't a one-off, I'm having a bad day. This is something that they do over a long period of time, and they do it consistently with everyone. It's not just although it will be seen, I guess, more acutely by one person because they get the unfiltered approach. But basically, for someone to be diagnosed with this narcissistic personality disorder, they have to demonstrate at least 5 traits in a way that causes significant interference with love or work over an extended period of time. And these traits include grandiosity and self-importance, persistent fantasies of success, power, and attractiveness, intellectual superiority or ideal love, a sense of being superior and special, a wish or a need to be admired, a strong sense of entitlement, someone who manipulates and exploits others, somebody who lacks empathy, somebody who believes that others are envious of them, but actually they are envious of others, and someone who is arrogant and has contemptuous attitudes and behaviors towards others. So those 9 criteria, if you like, are they're the 9 things that most commonly reveal themselves with narcissists. The problem is that no 2 narcissists are the same. Although they may adapt the same style of behavior, so they can be easy to see when you know what you're looking for, how they react is different. And so one person may be more extrovert, maybe more dominating, maybe more out there, charismatic, charming, in your face, life and soul of the party. And they may be easily noticed, but there's also a group of these people who don't display those same kinds of attitudes and behaviors unless they're in a really good mood. And even then, it's very rare. So they would be a lot quieter, a lot more reserved, a lot more withdrawn, far less likely to be noticed in a crowd. They might even come across as being a bit self-effacing or a little bit shy. The important thing about all of the narcissists, however they behave, is that at the core, they are incredibly insecure. And so what they do is they create this false persona or this mask or false self that they show to other people, which makes them seem confident, it makes them seem powerful, it makes them seem decisive, and it makes them seem that gives it a false sense of confidence to their persona, almost the point of arrogance in some cases. And that's all a big show to hide the underlying insecurity. So when they're out in a crowd of people, because they rely on those people outside themselves to feel good about themselves, because they basically feel rotten about themselves inside, but escape that kind of feeling as much as possible through playing out this game in their mind and in their life that they're someone else. It's almost like an alter ego. And so they're absolutely focused on making people think they're nice, making people think they're intelligent, that they're superior, that they're powerful, that they have lots of possessions, that they have lots of influence. All these things are important to them because it enables them to feel good about themselves. The problem is that when they have a victim, which is very often someone, in a loving relationship, a spouse or a girlfriend, boyfriend, that kind of thing, it's like they switch personalities, It's almost like Jekyll and Hyde, or that they would, in private, they suddenly become totally undermining, they become domineering, they become demanding, and they use like psychological tactics on their partner to make them feel psychologically unstable. So they will doubt and continually undermine what their spouse says or their girlfriend, boyfriend says. They will even deny things that have happened to the person's face, so that the victim's sense of reality is so distorted that they, first of all, they start thinking it must be their fault and it's something that they're doing. But also they lack all all confidence to make decisions for themselves. And at that point, the narcissist really has them hooked, because what happens is that, ironically, the victim looks to the narcissist for their sense of reality, which is, you couldn't get further from the truth, really. The narcissist lives in a land of unreality, and then you have the victim looking to that person who lives in the land of reality or unreality, looking to them for some sense of what reality is about. So it's a kind of messed up, dysfunctional relationship that plays out where one person has to be in charge, has to be in power, has to be in control. As long as they are, things will continue okay and will continue without too much of a problem or a kickback. The problem comes when the other person, for whatever reason, stops meeting their needs. That forces the narcissist to start looking a bit deeper or to see themselves, it sort of breaks that shell that they've created, and they run the risk of exposing their inner insecurities. And so, because these people have the psychological makeup of a 7-year-old, essentially, they've not developed emotionally since much beyond 7, 8 years old. You basically get a child's tantrum because they don't have that ability to regulate their emotions. And so they will, at the slightest thing, they will suddenly go from being cooperative to being in a total rage. And the person on the other end has no idea why that's happened. So, I mean, I'm not sure that's kind of answered your question, but it's just to paint a picture that when you're in one of these relationships,
Well,
you can imagine the difficulty for the person, the victim in that relationship, trying to talk to people outside about what's going on, because the people outside see such a completely different side to the narcissist to what the victim does. A common response is that a victim will share with a close friend about the abuse and about the way they've been treated. And because the close friend has never seen that, they will say, "Are you sure? Surely he's not, I don't think he can't be that bad. It takes two to tango." And all they do is effectively continue that devaluation and that gaslighting, which is the technical term for psychological manipulation of twisting truth for lies, until the person doesn't know which way up they are or which is which. The victim plucks up enough courage to talk to someone, and then suddenly, when they do share with them, that person gives them the same response as the narcissist would, which really only compounds their dilemma and only convinces them further that the victim, must be the ones who are at fault.
I have a couple of questions. So it sounds like to me, based on your description, that the outward person is different than the inward person. Their behaviors are almost same person. Behaviors are almost opposite of how they actually feel inside.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and then the other question I had for you is, out of those 9 traits, I'm sure not everyone has all 9 traits, or do they?
No, this is the problem, really. Trying to get narcissists diagnosed is a problem in itself, because at the heart of narcissism is insecurity, and at the heart of the insecurity is the inability to take ownership of any mistakes or faults. And so you've got these people who are incredibly fragile emotionally, who are desperately trying to convince everybody else that they're perfect, and trying to convince themselves that they're perfect. And so anything that challenges that will, as I said before, set them off into a knee-jerk reaction. Most of the time they can control that, but even so, when they don't, it's spectacular. Victims end up in hospital with bruises, broken bones. Sadly, some are even, murder is actually on the list of things that narcissists will commit. So it isn't that they need all of those 9 traits to be a narcissist. They don't. The problem is getting them diagnosed to do something about it, because they will never admit that they've made a fault, and therefore there's no need for them to get a diagnosis. It's everybody else's problem. And so what happens in that situation is that you have the narcissist who won't admit to the problem, but also has no real control over their emotional side, which, if you're a 300-pound guy who works out at the gym, it doesn't take much of a slap to put someone into serious problems. You know what I mean? It's very much that they don't need all of those traits, but it seems to be that the underlying trait throughout all narcissists, is a lack of empathy. So if you and I were interacting and you said, "I'm sorry, Stuart, that's really rude," or "I found that quite offensive," I would say, I would take a step back, look at what had been said, perhaps ask you what I said that upset you, and we would make it a conversation to get that resolved. Narcissists can't do that. They don't care about what they say or do. Their worldview is that everybody and everything in the world is there to serve them and them alone. And also they just don't, they really couldn't care less about the impact that they have on you, and they don't even examine it within themselves. So they can't do this thing, self-reflection, whereas normal people would say, yes, I've done something wrong. What did I do wrong? Yeah, thanks for telling me. I can see that. Now I'll make a change. Narcissists have no ability to self-reflect. And so they're almost like a bull in a china shop. They're just unfettered.
Is that because they're covering up their own inadequacies? They can't relate to others because they're so focused on their own inadequacy or sense of inadequacy?
It's more sinister than that, I think, because they focus on their inadequacy. They've created this false self to escape from the reality of them feeling insecure and being inadequate. And so they're living in a false existence, living in a magical world that doesn't exist. And they're convincing themselves and others about their greatness, about their unlimited power,
Right.
lovers, all the kind of things that they love to brag about. It's all a big show to kind of prevent them from having to look at what's going on inside and tackle their insecurities. So it really is. It's more of a safety net or a protective mechanism than someone who acknowledges that there's anything wrong with them. They've not got that ability, and they will do anything and everything that they have to avoid actually being introspective or even trying to look at themselves, because deep down they know that if they do, they will see imperfection, which to them is unacceptable, and therefore they become just like everybody else. They become a human being, and that in itself is not acceptable. They have to be the one in the pound. They have to be
So,
superior, special.
how does one challenge a narcissist without confrontation? How does that?
The best method is to disengage. So if you were likening that to a game of tennis, if the narcissist was to play a volley, you don't try and return it. You just put your racket down and walk off court. In other words, they're high confrontation people. They love to feel good about themselves because people say good things, but narcissists will also take any attention. It's like the toddler, if they can scream and throw a tantrum and get telling off and something, any attention is better than none. And so narcissists will often use confrontation and conflict as a way to make themselves feel good and feel superior. So typically they would bait someone and wind them up a little bit at a time until the other person snaps, loses the temper, and then the narcissist, with this cool persona, says things like, I told you you're not all there. It's clearly your fault in relationships. You never listen to me. You're always blowing off at me. You're shouting, you're losing control. And that's their chance to regain the power in a situation that they feel out of control. So if you're dealing with a narcissist, the best way is, if possible, to step away from engagement. That's not always easy, because at work, at home, if you have to be there, or if you're only just discovering that you're in a toxic relationship of some kind, you can't always just walk away and have no contact, because
Right.
it doesn't work like that.
Just walk away. Now, you wrote a book about this, right? Escaping the Void and How to Support Victims Out of Emotionally Abusive Relationships. You want to talk about your book?
It basically came out of this 5 years that I spent helping a friend out of this narcissistic marriage. And as a supporter, I was able to be independent. So in theory, I was able to not get emotionally caught up. But anybody who knows narcissism will understand. They're like hoovers or vacuum cleaners. They will suck you into the situation as much as they can because you just become another source of supply, another source of entertainment, another way for them to make, to make them feel good about themselves. So I kind of experienced that dark side of narcissism as a supporter rather than someone who was actually on the receiving end in a relationship. But if you support a narcissist, you might as well be married to them or, in a romantic relationship with them, because you will be targeted with all their tricks and traits, all their attempts to smear your name, to discredit you, etc. So the book was really written about the process, following the process through from discovering what the problem was through to creating a strategy to leaving the relationship, going through the divorce process. And it really is, it highlights the kinds of behaviors that you might expect from a narcissist, and it gives some, it highlights some of the mistakes we made, but also gives solutions as to how to keep focused on the subject rather than being continually distracted. Because this particular lady, her divorce over here, it's 6 months to a year is the typical time for a divorce, or it was at that time. Took her 3.5 years and £42,000 worth of legal debt to actually get away and escape from a husband. It's a costly business, and the book really gives you a behind the scenes view of where these costs can mount up, how to avoid the costs mounting up. And it's a book of, this is what we did, this worked, this didn't, so try this. This is a much better method. This is a sort of approved method by other people in the area, in the field of research in narcissism, that they would use to achieve a much more beneficial outcome. So it's written in a easy to read. I hate jargon, really. So some of the a lot of the jargon is in there, but it's all explained in simple terms so people know that when you talk about gaslighting, they understand what that means. And as far as possible, I just try and tell it almost in like a story fashion that people can relate to and hopefully learn from and apply to their own lives.
So we're gonna just about out of time, but I'd really like to understand the difference between some of the myths versus facts about narcissism. Can you share some of those before we go?
Most myths, I think the most dangerous myth is that narcissism is just a social inconvenience. We think of narcissism as someone who's got a bit of an attitude problem, someone who's a bit of a show off. They can be a bit abrupt, abrasive, they can be rude, etc. And it's just like the rest of us, but it's a little bit worse. True narcissism is a killer. So without getting involved in too many subtypes of and understanding what types of narcissists there's a type called a covert narcissist, who is the much shyer, retiring, reclusive narcissists. And if you look at their profile psychologically and the psychological profile of a mass shooter, for example, a lot of the guys, the recent Sandy Hook and the guys who've done the shootings, those psychological profiles are virtually identical. Narcissism isn't a social inconvenience. It can, in extreme cases, be a killer. And it's not something that we should tolerate, really. It's something that needs addressing head on, and it needs people in power to actually take some decision to, relieve them of the power. So businesses where narcissists are CEOs, head of the board, etc., they might appear to be doing reasonably well, but actually the amount of money they lose in a year through bullying, etc. Globally, I think it's about $11.7 trillion is lost through bullying and the impact of bullying at work. So it's a very real problem. It's not just some psychological inconvenience. It's a psychological terror, but it's also a social inconvenience. It's a social poison, really. It's a toxin that will affect wherever there is a narcissist, everything around the narcissist that relates to human interaction. And that includes business, that includes safety, those sorts of things are, they are affected, they are impacted, and they need addressing.
Yes. So, Stuart, before we go, where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon. If you put Escaping the Void into Amazon, if it comes up with Stuart Wood, then it's mine. It's quite easy to recognize. It's got a really bright black and yellow cover. Looks like you're having a migraine, but it's available on Amazon. In the UK, it's available in high street bookshops as well, but Amazon is your best first call where it's available as a paperback or as an ebook.
Very good. Well, Dr. Stuart Wood, this was a fascinating talk, and you shared a lot of details about narcissistic behavior, and I hope it's helpful to our listeners to, if they're involved in any type of abusive relationship, that this could help them get help, maybe identify something that's going on in a relationship. And I would imagine this doesn't just show up in like a marriage or something like that, but it can happen in the workplace, a lot of different relationships, right?
Yeah, it happens. Basically, wherever there's a human relationship, narcissism can show up, basically.
Yeah.
The only thing I would stress is that if people know that they've been on the receiving end and they want to seek some kind of therapy or counseling, make sure that it's the right sort. So it must be someone who is trauma informed or trauma aware. I think it's called trauma informed, because these people are the ones who know how to deal with it. If therapists haven't been trained in dealing with trauma, it's actually very easy for them to inadvertently re-traumatize the victim, the person who's trying to seek help, by asking those questions like, "Are you sure?" or "Is this really what you've experienced?" So you'll never get those sorts of questions from someone who's trauma aware. Leaving a narcissistic relationship will leave you with PTSD, and it's a form called complex PTSD, which is a long-term thing, but it can be equivalent to someone coming off a battle zone in terms of how people are emotionally left after a narcissistic relationship.
Dr. Wood, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate this information you shared, because it was in depth and very understandable. So
Lovely.
Thank again. You have been listening to Minutes with Mango, Life in Motion. Subscribe to hear a new and unique guest each week as they comment on their life's journey and share experiences with lifestyle, culture, and career. You can always find us at minuteswithmango.com.